Okay, guys, we're going to deal with some notes here from Chapter 7, Part 3. Part 3 of Chapter 7 deals with the social change and the cultural changes that were taking place during the 1920s, which also includes this thing called Prohibition, which dealt with the distribution, sale, and manufacturing of alcohol becoming illegal in the United States during the decade. If you recall, prior to now, we had been talking about the effects of World War I on the upcoming decade, the early 1920s. And we also talked about the economic changes, huge economic changes that were taking place in the United States during the 20s. Things from new consumer products, new consumer innovations, to the advent of the automobile, and not so much the advent of the automobile as much as how the automobile is now being mass produced in the United States by a guy named Henry Ford. So we took a look at that the other day, and we also took a look at the relationship between government and business and how the emphasis was placed on the relationship between government and business by the presidents of the decade, President Harding, and especially Harding and President Coolidge, where Coolidge, if you recall, was even quoted as saying the business of America should be business. So there was a very friendly, cozy relationship between the two. This part of Chapter 7 takes a look at, like I said, the cultural change, social changes, but also with it, the tension that started to exist in America as well. So let's get going here. The things that you want to know, for this section from Section 3, Part 3, for an upcoming test. 1, make sure that you're able to compare what economic and cultural life was like in the rural parts of America and compare that to the urban parts of America. This was for the first time in the 1920s where there was a division that existed between urban and rural America. Historically, divisions had always existed between, for example, North and South, especially during the Civil War and prior to the Civil War, or geographically East and West, people who lived on the eastern seaboard, to the east of the Appalachian Mountains, as opposed to the people who lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. But now we see a cultural division in society between urban and rural parts of America. Number 2, make sure you can discuss the changes involving U.S. immigration policy, because that would be much more strict in the 1920s. Immigration policy would be. Make sure that you can discuss the goals and the motives of the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacist group of the 1920s. This is known as the New Klan. The Klan was founded in the late 1860s, and now it's going to make a revival again in the 1920s. And make sure you can discuss the pros and cons of the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment was the amendment that did indeed allow for prohibition and basically made selling, manufacturing, and transporting alcohol illegal. So there are a number of videos in the Google link slides that I attached in Schoology. There is a live Google slide presentation of this same PowerPoint that has 3 videos in it. So what I'm going to have you do at times during this lecture is to pause me so you can go and watch those videos. That Google link presentation is found in the weekly lesson folder under week 8 for today's date, Tuesday, October 27th. Okay, so you will want to watch those videos. They are going to be good for you. They'll provide some color. They'll provide some action to this presentation here. So you will want to watch those, all right? And I'll let you know when to pause me so you can go do that. So one of the main questions here that we're dealing with is, how did Americans differ on the major social and cultural issues of the 1920s? Well, overall, most city dwellers enjoyed a very high standard of living, or a higher standard of living, certainly in the 1920s as opposed to before the 20s. While most farmers, for example, the rural parts of the country, were suffering through much harder times. I had mentioned prior to this that the agricultural sector of the U.S. economy was already in their Great Depression. So they are suffering very much. Crop prices are very low. Farmers are overproducing, which drove prices down even more. But if you lived in the city, you tended to be much better off than you were in the rural parts of the country. You also had two different visions of what the nation's future would look like. You had one vision, I should say, took a more modern approach to what the country would look like. And again, that was more associated with the urban parts of the country. And then you also had a vision of the country that wanted to see the country kind of go back to the way it was prior to World War I, a more traditional approach or a more traditional vision of the nation's future. And what that did is it set up now, or it heightened tensions between these two different approaches to the country's future. And with that, it set up tension between the cities, the urban part of the country, and the rural part of the country. And that's going to be played out in many different events here in the 1920s, some of which we'll look at here in this presentation. All right, so for the first time in 1920, the 1920 census reported that for the first time in American history, that more people lived in urban areas than in rural regions. And what that would do is that it would have profound consequences. The nation would be divided like it had never been before. Like I said earlier, historically, it usually was divided between north-south or between east-west. But in the 1920s, this split was now between urban America and rural America. And on virtually every important social and cultural issue, the two groups were divided. Okay? In the cities, many people enjoyed economic prosperity that the 20s was known for. And if you tended to live in those urban centers, you tended to be more open to change and more open to social change and new ideas. This was known as modernism. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. I believe it is a vocab word in your textbook. So make note of that. However, if you were living in the rural part of the country, most Americans in rural America did not participate fully in all of the consumer bonanzas and the new consumer innovations and inventions. And many of them tended to miss out on all the new forms of leisure. And people in the rural sectors of the country generally embraced a more traditional view of religion, science, culture, and all of those things. And like I said, this is what sets up this tension, this conflict between these two ways of life. You notice the two arrows there in the meeting kind of colliding. That's what we're getting at here. All right. So we have this tension that's building in the country. And when I say tension that is building, what I'm really referring to is that there is a clash of values that's starting to take place. One is, like I said, more urban, which is known as modernism. And modernism, like I said, were those people who tended to live more in the cities that emphasized science, emphasized secular values. Secular, if you're not familiar with that term, secular means non-religious or not having to do or affiliated with any religion. And like I said, it was centered more in the urban parts of the country. The other side of the coin that, in conflict to modernism was Christian fundamentalism. And fundamentalism was a term that emphasized Protestant teachings and the belief that every word of the Bible was the literal truth. Okay, so in the 1920s, many devout Americans believed that Christianity was under siege. It was under attack throughout the world. And they pointed to any number of events that were taking place as proof of that. You had the Russian Revolution take place in 1917, where the government was cracking down on the Orthodox Church. You had the revolution in Mexico, where there was assaults on the Roman Catholic Church in Mexico. So they pointed to events around the world where they believed that Christianity was under attack. And this is what fueled their argument, while at the same time you had the modernist argument that was emphasizing more science and secular values. And that really set up this conflict of tensions. And then on top of it all, too, you also had attitudes toward education that were starting to change. And again, education was one of those areas where you had both an urban perspective and you had more of a rural perspective. In rural America, the idea of going to formal education for any prolonged period of time really was kind of way out there. You know, it really wasn't something that people did. Most people who lived in rural America and the way they viewed education, at least for a prolonged period of time, was just simply not vital. The reason is that farmers expected their children basically to master the 3 R's: writing, reading, and arithmetic. All right, and beyond that, education tended to collide and get in the way of many farmers' tasks, right? And they depended on their children to do these tasks. The most important qualities that a child could have wasn't necessarily an education as much as it was to be strong, to be, have a lot of endurance, and to be actually knowledgeable about farming, knowledgeable with crops, knowledgeable with animals. Those things were more important than what farmers called book learning, okay? But if you lived in more of the urban parts, a prolonged period of time in education was very valuable. Mental ability, not physical fitness, not muscular fitness, was more important. That was an essential ingredient to be successful in life. Mastering math, mastering different languages, that could spell the difference between getting a low-paying, unskilled job and a very high-paying position in an office as an office worker someplace. So by 1930, there were more American teenagers, just like yourself, who were graduating from high school, and more Americans than ever before were going to college. So even though you could say that the urbanites maybe would win out on the educational battleground, there was still plenty of tension and conflict when it came to views about education, at least for a prolonged period of time. We're talking about a full 12 or 13 years going through a K-12 system. And education would actually be one of those battleground topics where fundamentalists and modernist views or values would clash. And they would clash in the famous 1925 Scopes monkey trial. And I'm just going to briefly go through this slide here. And then what I'm going to want you to do is to pause the video here. All right, you're going to pause me. Go to the Schoology folder, bring up the link to the active Google Slides, find the slide that follows this one. All right, it's going to look something like this. And you're going to want to watch the video entitled The Scopes Monkey Trial Explained. It's about 5 minutes. And you will want to do that. Like I said, it is going to be good for you, and they are going to explain all the details and the significance of the Scopes monkey trial. Long and short of it right now, the state of Tennessee made it illegal to teach evolution in public schools. And the American Civil Liberties Union approached a biology teacher in Dayton, Tennessee. His name was John Scopes, if he would be willing to teach evolution in school, to challenge the law. The name of the law was the Butler Act. And the defense attorney that defended John Scopes, his name was Clarence Darrow. He at the time was the most famous and most renowned defense attorney in the country. And he tried to use science as part of their defense to cast doubt on religious beliefs. So this is kind of what we're talking about when it came to education, specifically in this case, evolution. So what I want you to do now is pause me, go watch the video. The video is in the folder. And when you come back, we will continue. Okay? Pause me now. Okay. Thank you for pausing me. Now you're back. Hopefully you got out of that video what you need to know about the Scopes monkey trial. And that is, the Scopes monkey trial, for one thing, garnered national attention. Okay. In fact, it was really one of those ways that Dayton was looking, in some cases, to make, like you heard in the video, make a few dollars by bringing attention to the city and having people come there. People were flocking to Dayton all over the country, from all over the country. And as you heard, they nicknamed this the monkey trial because of the belief that Darwin claimed that human beings had descended from monkeys. And I told you that the ACLU approached John T. Scopes to teach evolution in school. Clarence Darrow defended him, and the prosecutor was William Jennings Bryan. And this wasn't a trial that was about guilt or innocence. John Scopes' guilt was known from the start, right? I mean, he basically volunteered to do it. What this trial was a microcosm, right, or an example, a symbol of the greater tension and conflict that already existed in society when it came to the more modern approach, the more modern values of the country, right? Values that emphasize science as opposed to the fundamentalist views that emphasized religion. And that was the conflict that came through. And this was one of those events that made that conflict, that tension evident in American society. You heard in the video, Scopes was indeed, of course, found guilty, right? Big shocker, of teaching evolution and fined. If I remember right, he was fined $100. And then later he was gotten off because of a technicality that took place during the trial. What the Scopes trial did, like I said, is it showcased a major cultural and religious division that existed in American society. And it did not heal the conflict or answer any of the central questions. When the trial was over, each side still believed in the truth of their own position, right? And this is something that largely exists still to this day. It really hasn't gone away over the past 100 years. Okay, next topic was immigration. And immigration would prove to be another cultural clash involving this ongoing boom of immigration that started to take place prior to the 1920s and into and through the decade. And just like in the past, Americans known as nativists. Nativists, if you were a nativist, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term. A nativist is someone who favors policies, for example, immigration policies, that favor native-born citizens, in this case Americans, and they hurt non-native-born people, usually immigrants in some way. All right, so that's a nativist. Immigrants were again then at the center of another clash during the 1920s. Nativists feared that immigrants, for example, were taking their jobs away from native-born workers, and they were going to threaten American traditions. Okay, and generally, although nativist politicians have been able to restrict immigration from China in 1882, if you remember the Chinese Exclusion Act, so politicians were able to ban Chinese people from coming into the country. They really didn't have much success in restricting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And that's where a lot of this nativist feeling was coming from. So right on the eve of World War I, 1913, 1914, Congress would be able to pass a law that required immigrants to take literacy tests, for example. So immigrants who couldn't read or write their own language were prohibited from entering the United States. President Wilson actually vetoed that law, but Congress overrode that, and it became a law. And then during the 1920s, during this Red Scare era, remember we had a large fear of communists, in the country, socialists coming from Eastern Europe. People were afraid that immigrants were radical, and they were bringing these radical ideas to the United States. And this started off another round of debates on our immigration policy. And the problem that nativists had to deal with was the traditional immigration policy. All Americans who could trace their ancestry back far enough, of course, could trace it back to foreign origins, right? We all come from immigrants in some way. So that was the problem that nativists had. They had a hard time justifying that. So many people in the United States viewed the immigration experience as what made Americans American, right? So that was the tension. People, much like today, there were people who are pro-immigration, people who are anti-immigration. Same existed back in the 1920s, right? So continuing on here, there was some major legislation that Congress did pass. It was based on what was called a quota system. A quota system just simply means it was based on a certain number that Congress established in 1924. And the first piece of major legislation, immigration legislation, indeed, was passed in 24. It's called the National Origins Act. In fact, there was one before this one known as the Emergency Quota Act in 1921. That one and this one, 1924, the Origins Act, kind of go hand in hand. And what it did is it set up a quota system in the United States to govern immigration from certain specific countries. So with the National Origins Act, the formula was very simple. The number of immigrants of a given nationality each year coming into the country could not exceed 2% of the number of people of that nationality living in the United States based on 1890's population. Okay, so you might ask, well, why did they pick 1890? 1890 was the year chosen because it came before the great wave of immigration that took place from Southern and Eastern Europe. In other words, that's when the numbers were lowest. So, for example, this act permitted around 65,000 immigrants from England and Northern Ireland to come to America every year, but it only allowed about 6,800 Italians. Okay, that's because the 2% was based on the number of Italians that were living here in 1890. Okay, so there was probably a very small number of Italians, and now they allowed 2% of that number of Italians to enter the country under the National Origins Act in 1924. So in other words, it was very targeted towards Southern and Eastern Europeans. Okay, it was very restrictive of those immigrants. And you can see the sources of immigration from this time, 1865 to 1915, the chunk of them came from Southern and Eastern Europe. So the National Origins Act and the Emergency Quota Act both targeted Southern and Eastern Europeans. All right. It also limited to a certain degree Asian people as well. But like I said, the majority came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Okay. Switching gears a little bit, there were also examples of tension and conflict that came to light, played out in different trends that started to take place. Urbanization, modernism. There was a growing element in society. U.S. society was becoming more diverse. And what that led to was more people who were starting to lash out against this diversity and change. And this brought or led to the creation of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the KKK, the white supremacist group, was originally founded during the Civil War, right after the Civil War in the South. But the KKK would soon rise again, beginning around 1915. And it took place in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Like I said, the original Klan had been formed in the South during the late 60s and 70s, largely to terrorize African Americans who wanted to vote. They had gained the right to vote. That was the old Klan. So this Klan was different in the sense that not only did it target African Americans, but also now it targeted Jews, it targeted Catholics, it targeted immigrants. They were very nativist. Okay, this was a classic example of people who were very nativist. The Klan also claimed to stand against what they called lawbreakers and people who were immoral. In fact, one of their leaders was quoted as saying, quote, "Every criminal we're against, every gambler, every crooked politician is fighting the Klan," end quote. And at the height of its power or its membership in the 1920s, they had somewhere between 4 to 5 million members. And most were in the South, but keep in mind that the Klan had branches all throughout the Midwest. In fact, many rural areas had pockets or branches of the KKK, and also in smaller industrial cities. And one center of the Klan's strength was actually in Indiana. Indiana kind of became the home of this new Klan in 1915. All right. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to pause me again, and you're going to be watching the video found in the folder that's about the KKK, the rise of the new KKK in the 1920s. So pause me now, and then come back and we'll continue on with the next topic. Okay, welcome back. There were plenty of individuals and organizations that opposed the Klan. And in the video, you saw how the Klan was founded, who they targeted, what they were known for, and where they were located. But there were many others who actually embraced this idea of racial change, ethnic diversity, religious diversity. And, one of those groups was the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's the largest civil rights organization in the country still to this day, simply because many people viewed and valued the idea that the United States was indeed a melting pot of different kinds of people, and that all of us can trace our ancestry back to immigrants of some kind, right? So groups like the NAACP, the Jewish Anti-Defamation League, worked to counter and to fight the Klan and its values. They embraced the idea of racial, ethnic, and religious and cultural diversity. And like I said, for them, the melting pot idea was still very much something in the 1920s. Now, the Klan itself became extremely corrupt throughout the decade of the 1920s and into the 30s. Its leaders were bribing politicians. They would steal their members' dues. Members of the KKK had to pay dues, and they would steal those. The Klan leadership would lie to its members. In fact, their leader, the leader that led the Klan in Indiana, his name is David Stevenson, eventually would be brought up on charges of assault and second-degree murder, and he actually was found guilty and spent time in the federal penitentiary for murder. Although the Klan never entirely disappeared, by the late 50s and 60s, it certainly would not be as important and significant as it would be in the 1920s and 30s. Okay. All right, so that was the Klan. And now moving on, the last example that I want to call your attention to that displayed these cultural tensions and conflict in society between the old and the new was with something called Prohibition. Okay. Now, Prohibition became a very divisive issue in the United States. In other words, when we say prohibition, we're referring to the banning of alcohol use. Now, this goes back all the way to the early 1800s when you had reformers. They were known as temperance reformers. These were people who had crusaded against the use and drinking and sale and making of alcohol. This goes all the way back to the 1820s, 30s, and 40s and the reform movements of that decade. By 1917, so by World War I or so, I think roughly about 75% or 80% of Americans lived in what was called a dry county. Dry means where the county had banned liquor altogether. So it'd be like Hennepin County, right? The county that Minnetonka is in, would ban alcohol tomorrow. Hennepin County would be a dry county. So World War I actually brought on the call for more temperance, for more and more people wanting to ban alcohol. It seemed, even for people unpatriotic, to use corn and wheat and barley, all the things that are needed to make alcohol. It seemed unpatriotic, believe it or not, to use those things when soldiers actually needed those things for bread or for food. So more and more people viewed those farm goods, right, as being more patriotic to make and use those things for the soldiers overseas than it was for alcohol. So World War I actually brought on a call for more temperance. Now, the government would eventually ban alcoholic beverages. And by 1919, the states would ratify the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. If you look in the Constitution, it will be there. It's probably crossed out because eventually it would be repealed. But in 1919, it became the law of the land, Prohibition did. And what the 18th Amendment did is it basically did three things. It forbade it prevented the manufacturing, the distribution, so you couldn't transport it anywhere, and you couldn't sell alcohol anywhere in the United States. Okay, now this was a federal amendment. It was the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. The amendment had been largely passed on the strength of people who lived in rural America. That's where a lot of the support came from. And then Congress followed it up by passing the Volstead Act. This was the act that basically gave the 18th Amendment bite. All right, you think of it like a dog, right? When you hear the saying a dog is all bark and no bite. Well, the bark was probably the 18th Amendment. What gave it bite was the Volstead Act. Because now, if you were making, distributing, transporting, or selling alcohol, you could be arrested and go to jail. Okay? So people who were in favor of prohibition, they were known as dries. All right, these are people who were in favor of it, and they called prohibition a noble experiment. They argued that prohibition improved people's lives, it improved the individual, right? That alcohol was evil in some way. What else? It strengthened family relationships, and even created better societies. This had been the argument among temperance leaders and quote-unquote dries, going all the way back, like I said, to the 1830s. All right. In fact, drinking, as well as alcoholism, liver disease caused by drinking, did start to decline during Prohibition. So as far as medical issues that people would have, those actually did start to go down. People who were against Prohibition were known as the wets, the quote-unquote wets. And they countered that the ban on alcohol did not stop people from drinking at all. Instead, they argued that prohibition would help create an atmosphere of hypocrisy. It would lead to organized crime, which it did. It would lead to the organization known as the Mafia in the United States. And that's where I want you to stop me now, pause me now, and what I'd like for you to do is to watch the video on prohibition. And not only does it cover prohibition, but it also talks about, more importantly, how prohibition led to the rise of the mafia in the United States, how it led to organized crime. All right, so when you get there, you'll see this slide. This will be the last slide of the show, the presentation here. Watch that video, all right? You will want to do that. Like I said, it'll add a lot of color and a lot of action, and you'll be able to see the connection between prohibition and how it led to organized crime in America. All right, and that's all there is. So once you've done that, you're able to, of course, now watch back and forth. Feel free to go back and forth and watch this over again or parts of it. But these are the lecture notes for 7.3, and I'm sure you'll hear from me again really soon. All right, thanks, guys.